Welcome to the Unfettered Speech Podcast. I'm Patrick Sullivan.
And I'm Leonard Goodman.
Well, Leonard, we have a great guest today,
We do?
friend of yours. Why don't you just kick it off and let's get
Okay,
right
let's
into
do
it.
that. Our guest today is Stephen Donziger, one of the most successful attorneys at taking on corporate criminals, perhaps since Ralph Nader. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, worked as a public defender, and in 1993 he began representing 30,000 indigenous villagers in Ecuador. And the case went to trial against Chevron. And what they established at the trial was that Chevron had dumped about 16 billion gallons of toxic waste into the villagers' water system, the groundwater, poisoning the groundwater. It's been dubbed the Amazon Chernobyl. Why did Chevron do this? Well, it was established that they did it because they saved about about $3 a barrel on the oil by not properly disposing of the waste. With Stephen Donziger in court, got about a $9 billion judgment against Chevron. The money has never been paid. Instead, when the case got back to the United States, Chevron hired I think it was some 2,000 or 3,000 corporate lawyers to personally attack Stephen Donziger. And they ended up paying, if I understand correctly, they ended up paying a corrupt Ecuadorian judge named Guerra $2 million to say that Stephen Donziger committed bribery in order to win the judgment. The district judge in the Southern District of New York ordered Stephen Donziger to turn over all of his electronic equipment. Stephen Donziger refused attorney-client privilege. They held him in contempt. The New York prosecutors refused to take the case, but the district judge, a man named Kaplan, appointed basically Chevron's attorneys as a private prosecutor to prosecute Stephen Donziger. That case has been going on for years and years. In 2023, I believe, Cert was denied. So a petition to the United States Supreme Court over the constitutionality of a judge appointing private lawyers as prosecutors to prosecute someone. Maybe we could start and talk a little bit about that case, but it was interesting that Cert was denied, but the only two judges that were on your side were too conservative. I think Gorsuch and I forget the other one. So maybe we could start with that opinion and the significance of that. And basically, what's the legal issue there of a federal district judge appointing a private law firm to prosecute you because the prosecutors declined the case?
Well, thanks for having me. In a nutshell, the antecedent to that, the antecedent to that is I've been working many years on the underlying case against Chevron to hold it accountable for creating the world's worst oil disaster, done, by the way, deliberately. It was not an accident. This is a function of an engineering design invented by Texaco, later bought by Chevron, to systematically discharge literally billions of gallons of cancer-causing oil waste into rivers and streams that indigenous communities and farmer communities in this area of Ecuador and the Amazon were using for their drinking water, for their bathing, and for their fishing. So this caused a massive health problem, cancer, rampant cases of cancer. Many people have died. There's virtually no medical care. And all of this was part of the lawsuit that Chevron tried to block every step of the way from happening. And once it started to happen, they tried to block it from finishing. And it took us 18 long years to get to a verdict in 2011, where the communities, these very brave communities, won a $19 billion judgment, actually, the largest environmental judgment ever, which was later cut in half on appeal by Ecuador Supreme Court, but otherwise affirmed. So we have this final judgment in Ecuador Rather than pay the judgment, Chevron went after me personally back in New York where I live. And they, in my opinion, engage in, blatantly corrupt acts to essentially try to destroy me as a way to not pay the indigenous peoples of Ecuador that they poisoned. And the way that part happened primarily is they began by suing me for $60 billion. I got sued for more money than anyone in U.S. history. By the way, that's billion, not million. Treble damages on the underlying judgment that we won under a Civil RICO statute. They denied me a jury. They steered the case to a judge who had investments in Chevron, who was very pro-corporate, this gentleman named Lewis Kaplan. He denied me every step of the way my due process rights. They orchestrated what was essentially a show trial in a U.S. court without a jury. And their main witness was a guy, as you mentioned, they paid millions of dollars to, and they coached him actually for 53 days to testify falsely against me before Judge Kaplan, that I somehow orchestrated the bribe of a judge. Didn't happen. There's zero evidence it happened other than this guy's paid witness testimony, this false witness testimony. And this man, his name is Alberto Guerra, later admitted under oath in a separate case that he had lied repeatedly on the stand testifying before Judge Kaplan against me. The case really isn't worth the paper it's printed on. It was an orchestrated attempt to neutralize my ability to be a lawyer and continue to represent these communities. It was a wholesale attack on the people of Ecuador through me. I was the surrogate. And ultimately, when we fought through that case and kept going in our efforts to force Chevron to comply with the law and pay the judgment that they owed to the people of Ecuador, they concocted a new case, a criminal contempt of court case, that you point out, or pointed out in your introduction. Kaplan charged me with a crime for refusing to turn over my confidential case file, protected by attorney-client privilege, to Chevron's lawyers. There's never been such an order in the history of U.S. jurisprudence, never, not once. So I told Judge Kaplan quite honestly, I said, there's no way I'm turning that case file over. I invited him to hold me in civil contempt of court. Instead, he held me in criminal contempt of court. By the way, criminal contempt of court means a judge charges you with disobeying his or her order. It's the only crime a judge can charge. Every other crime, the prosecutor or grand jury has to charge. So he charged me, but once a judge charges that particular crime, which I believed at the time and still believe was baseless, he had to refer it to the U.S. federal prosecutor for prosecution, because judges can't prosecute crime. Prosecutors prosecute crime. When the federal prosecutor refused to prosecute me is when this really went off the rails, and Kaplan appointed a Chevron law firm, private lawyers and a corporate Chevron law firm, to stand in the shoes of the U.S. government and prosecute me directly. I became the first person ever targeted with a private corporate criminal prosecution. One of the first things they did when I went in to deal with this was they, had asked the judge to slap an ankle bracelet on me, and they had me locked up in my home in Manhattan under house arrest on the theory that I was going to flee the country, which again was preposterous. By the way, the contempt of court charge was a misdemeanor, punishable by a maximum of 6 months in prison. They created this fiction I was going to flee. Of course, I would not have. In any event, they used that as a basis to keep me confined in my home. And then they kept me the trial kept getting delayed, and they kept me that way for 2 years and 2 months. I was over 4 times the maximum sentence I could get had I been convicted before I could even get a trial, confined in my home. And when I complained to the judge, there's a different judge appointed by Kaplan. They're all friends up there. She said, "You're not confined." I said, "What do you mean I'm not confined? I'm stuck at home and I can't leave and I have an ankle bracelet on." She says, "No, you're free, but with conditions. If I confined you, you would be in jail or prison." So they created this fiction that my 2 years and 2 months didn't really count as part of my sentence. It was just, I was actually free in their eyes, just couldn't move about. So ultimately, she denied me a jury, refused to let me mount a defense, and convicted me. And then on top of the 2 years, or by then it was 6 months, I spent in home confinement. She sentenced me to the maximum term possible of 6 months in prison. This entire ordeal lasted 993 days, almost 3 years, on a charge that had a maximum sentence of 6 months. It was in my opinion, an act of political and corporate persecution against a successful human rights lawyer. It ended, by the way, in 2022, and it's now, over 4 years later. But I will say, when you see what's going on in the United States today, I think what happened to me was the canary in the coal mine. Like, there's never been a case where a lawyer or any individual has been prosecuted directly by a corporation, a fossil fuel company no less, that had, successfully gone after it and won the largest environmental judgment ever. This case will go down in history as a real stain on the United States, on our system of jurisprudence. Of course, with everything that's happened since Trump came in a second time, it almost seems not that bad by comparison to some of the stuff we're watching. But to this day, there's never been any individual who's been prosecuted directly by a corporation, imprisoned directly by a corporation other than me.
Stephen, you would have thought that you would have had some support from the liberals on the Supreme Court on this issue of a federal judge appointing a prosecutor to prosecute you. We do have separation of powers. The executive branch is the one that's supposed to do the prosecuting, and the judges are supposed to do the judging. And this was especially appointing a prosecutor that works for Chevron. You would think the liberals would have been concerned about this. Why do you think none of them spoke up? The only two were Gorsuch, and tell me who was the other judge?
Kavanaugh.
Those were the only two that would have granted cert in the case. Why? Do you have a theory as to why none of the liberals?
I do have a theory, and it's really actually kind of at least intellectually interesting, even though it doesn't really get me anywhere. So what happened was, as this went on, this was so offensive to anyone who believes in the rule of law that it sort of transcended politics. I started to get a lot of support from Federalist Society lawyers and judges, in addition to environmental, activists and lawyers, et cetera. And what happened was, when I got convicted and served a prison term based on this misdemeanor contempt of court charge that, again, to me was baseless and had already been rejected by the prosecutor's office, it attracted a lot of attention, and I was approached by several lawyers to represent me, able lawyers to represent me pro bono, and on appeal I was represented by very prominent, I would say, liberal lawyers, as well as some people who came out of the Federalist Society camp. And I welcomed all the help I could get, because I thought it was important to convey to the Supreme Court, ultimately, that this was really not a political issue. This was a crazy violation of the rule of law that should not be allowed to happen in any democratic society with a checks and balances system. And what ended up happening is, on appeal to the Second Circuit, the circuit affirmed my prosecution in a 2-1 decision, but the dissent was written by a Trump-appointed judge who wrote a 19-page dissent sort of outlining the whole argument of why this entire case was unconstitutional and violated the separation of powers doctrine, violated the appointments clause, and other types of, kind of technical legal issues. So that dissent in the circuit court decision really provided the blueprint to take it up to the Supreme Court on cert. And I had an incredible legal team, and in the cert petition, they outlined all the problems with what had happened to me. By the way, no one talked about what happened to the people of Ecuador. This is all just like a defect in the case in the United States against me. Like, the whole pollution problem at this stage of the case wasn't even mentioned barely, okay? And then it got to the court, and the conservatives on the court were inclined to help me because they believe in this unitary theory of the executive, which we've now seen manifest in a whole other series of cases, right, which is essentially handing Donald Trump autocratic, if not dictatorial, power. But in my case, they did not like the idea that a judge, as opposed to the executive branch, could prosecute a crime and name, the prosecutor to do it and oversee it at the same time. I mean, Kaplan was essentially the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury all together in my case, which obviously is illegal. So they didn't like that.
Other countries have a system like, am I correct? Where the judge can be the prosecutor as well? Is that?
Well, civil law countries do, France, Spain. I mean, but, how do I explain it? They do have a system where the judge is more the investigator who gets
Right.
the facts and then also oversees the case. But there's checks in those systems such that the judge has to behave professionally and cannot just go off the wall, but in a way that I think Judge Kaplan did in this case for really political reasons and pro-corporate reasons. But ultimately, I think I was potentially headed to, if it had been granted cert, to a 9-0 decision overturning my conviction. But what happened is, it got up there and they relisted it 5 times. I don't know if the people who listen to your podcast understand, but like very few cases that get applied to the Supreme Court are allowed to be heard. I mean, there's only like 60, 70 cases a year now.
Right.
Maybe one out of every several hundred that get up there on a petition for certiorari get accepted. And usually they try to take the most weighty cases or the cases where they want to make a political point, which we're seeing more and more lately. In my case, the conservatives wanted to use it as a vehicle to hand the presidency more power, that is, to rebuke Kaplan for taking over an executive branch function. And they were entirely correct in their analysis. But they wanted to use it to sort of, implement this, what they call the unitary theory of the executive. So to answer your question, I think the 3 centrist liberals, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Ketanji Jackson Brown, wouldn't go along with it, not because they didn't agree that I got completely screwed and that this was unconstitutional. They didn't want the principle through my case to be established that would hand more power to the executive branch. So my case got caught up in the internal politics of the court, which is why Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. So the other thing is, when you get denied cert, as you probably know, it's very rare for any opinion to be written.
Sure.
Just a notice is put out, you get denied. In my case, there was a dissent written, which is highly unusual. It was 5 pages. Gorsuch wrote it, Kavanaugh joined it, and in the dissent to the denial of my petition to be heard, Gorsuch said, he said that, the Constitution does not allow what happened here to happen.
Yeah.
So ultimately, 2 Supreme Court justices are on record saying what happened to me was unconstitutional. There's the judge who wrote the dissent at the Second Circuit, who's on record saying it was unconstitutional. That's 3 judges. And the irony is, on the Second Circuit level, the other 2 judges who voted to affirm, also Trump appointees, agreed that what happened to me was unconstitutional. So that's 5 judges. But the reason the 2 at the circuit level voted to affirm is because they claimed my lawyers did not object in the right kind of way to the specific violation of the Appointments Clause to preserve the issue for appeal, which was, in my opinion, utter hogwash. All we did was yell and scream and howl during that entire trial about how this was not permissible under the Constitution. So even those guys who affirmed on technical grounds, not because it was right. So ultimately, 5 U.S. federal judges, 3 from the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, 2 from the U.S. Supreme Court are on record stating that what happened to me was unconstitutional. And by the way, on top of that, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention of the United Nations, for those who don't know, is a body to deal with human rights complaints brought by individuals, composed of 5 respected international jurists, took up my case and ruled unanimously that it violated all sorts of international legal provisions. So I have the 5 federal judges, I have the 5 international jurists, and then on top of that, I got a lot of support from lots of people, including 68 Nobel laureates who, criticized what was happening to me openly. And also, ultimately, I once my conviction stood and the Supreme Court refused to take the case, I asked President Biden to pardon me, and 34 members of Congress signed a letter asking Biden to pardon me for this preposterous conviction, and Biden refused to pardon me. I was waiting literally until the last hour of his presidency, and he didn't pardon me. In 6 hours, literally into Trump's first day in office in his second term, he pardons the 1,600 insurrectionists who tried to overturn our government. It's outrageous Biden didn't pardon me, but more outrageous is that this happened. And I think that the level of corporate control over our judiciary, people can see it more openly now. But when it happened to me, it wasn't as obvious. And, again, even as bad as it might be now under Trump, nothing has happened under Trump that quite approximates the idea of an oil company coming in and becoming the government and locking up a human rights lawyer. I mean, I still can't believe it happened. As I sit here today, it's hard for me to get my arms around, but it happened.
I want to get Pat into this discussion, but let me just ask you about that, the sort of the corporate influence over judges, because, Jimmy Carter famously said we have a system of legalized bribery in this country, and I don't think too many people really dispute that anymore. But it was always sort of assumed that you've got, that basically the bribery applies to the executive branch and the legislative branch, but not to the judicial branch. Because the judicial branch, of course, they have lifetime appointments. They're not supposed to be affected by politics. But clearly they are. And I don't think any case really highlights that as much as your case, where basically they took the side of Chevron. And of course, like you say, the indigenous people that won this judgment haven't seen a penny. So I guess my question is, do we have because if you have all three branches of government that are basically bought and paid for, then I don't know, people use the word fascism, but that's really the merger of corporations and the state. So are we there yet?
I think, look, I think that it's not out of school to use the word fascism to describe what's happening. But this is my point I want to make. I'm careful in my use of language. I mean, you could call Trump an autocrat, you can call him an authoritarian, call him a fascist. I mean, his past Joint Chiefs of Staff said, I've looked at this man in the eye, he's got fascism in his heart. And if you really understand the rise of fascist leaders like Mussolini and Hitler, and other authoritarian leaders, like Gaddafi and Berlusconi and Trump and Pinochet in Chile, like you see a playbook. And there's a book written about this that I literally just read, so it's fresh in my head, called Strongman, written by a professor at New York University, that sort of outlines the playbook these leaders use. And Trump is using the same playbook. And I do believe Trump wants to govern as a fascist. Fascism, though, isn't just like a moment in time. I mean, when you have a liberal democracy, there's always seeds of fascism that exist, people who believe that democracy is inefficient and that we need strong leaders to run a more efficient society. And just because you have open fascism doesn't mean you don't have seeds of liberal democracy there. I describe it more as a constant contest between how a society that believes in the free markets is going to be governed. Will it be governed with, bedrock principles of democracy like free speech, rule of law, or is it going to be governed, by an authoritarian or even a dictator, which is how I believe Trump wants to govern. It's hard to carry that out in the United States, even with all the power that Trump has amassed, even with all the power that the Supreme Court, unfortunately, has given to Trump. It's still hard because there's too many people who are onto it. There's too many people opposed to it. There's too many institutions that don't abide by what he is trying to order them to do. But he still has amassed an unprecedented amount of power for a president in this country, as you know. And I think that in my case, the Supreme Court was, excuse me, the Gorsuch-Kavanaugh camp was trying to use my case to give the presidency more power. But, my case is just one of many. I mean, there's other more influential cases in terms of, laying the legal basis for this man to govern as a dictator, including, of course, the immunity case and the Slaughter case about, being able to fire independent agency heads. There's so many cases that the Supreme Court has just given this man more and more power. By the way, they would never do that if a Democrat was in office. But of course, a Democrat president would never try to get that kind of power because they generally respect the rule of law. So, I think that we're living in very perilous times. I think what happened to me, by the way, not enough people even know what happened to me. I mean, when it happened, a fair number of people knew. But not enough people know that how bad it can get in terms of corporate capture of our institutions of government, including our judges. And you talk about bribery. I mean, we have legalized bribery in the United States. I mean, you can give any amount of money you want to influence an election. Like no other country, almost no other country in the civilized world, in the northern world, northern part of the world, allows that to happen, except the United States. It is cowboy elections where money rules, and it is extremely difficult to overcome that when you're being outspent 100 to 1, as Cori Bush was, or Jamal Bowman when they were, progressive congresspersons who were attacked by AIPAC because they were critical of the government of Israel and how it was carrying out its attacks on Gaza. And you see this all the time now in U.S. elections. It is extremely hard to be a progressive or even a moderate and get elected in the United States, given how money seems to be able to dictate who the candidates can be and what kind of messages voters receive. So, I'll say we're up against a lot now. I mean, I've been, fighting for justice as a lawyer for decades now, for almost 4 decades. And, it's never been like this. I will say I'm not distressed in the sense that, I'm not depressed. I'm up every day with enthusiasm and determination trying to do what I can to fight this. But, a lot of young people really, I think, don't have the historical perspective of those of us who've been around for a while to understand that it is really, really bad right now in the United States. But I do see a future, though, with more and more people empowered, that we can really reverse this and try to restabilize our country and get back to a situation where government, functions as it should, which is to protect the people, not be captured by corporate wealth or oligarchical wealth, and really serve the wealthy. And that's what our government does right now, in my opinion.
Well, I think to follow up on Leonard's question, Stephen, he was asking, is the judiciary politicized in effect, right? Because he was saying the corporations control the judiciary. But there's 2 steps here. Is the judiciary politicized? And as you say, the political process has been dominated by money and oligarchs. Therefore, if you control the political process and you've politicized the judiciary, money controls the judiciary, right? So it seems to me that the first question is in your opinion, is the judiciary politicized?
The answer is yes.
And
But
I'm
I
surprised actually
want
that
to
you said that you kind of threw the January 6th people under the bus that way, because that trial was very political and in my opinion, very unjust. I mean, they took an Enron statute about disrupting a proceeding and shoehorn that into putting these people in the solitary confinement. Don't you think that was a political decision and a political prosecution?
It's all political. I mean, who are we kidding? I mean, I was in prison in Danbury for 6 weeks, and how is it political? I mean, there's people who are attacked or prosecuted for political reasons like me. The January 6th, was that political or not? I believe that was an outrageous attack on our institutions provoked by Trump. People can argue about that, whatever, but the reality is it's not just who they choose to prosecute, it's how long the sentences are, how you're treated once you're on the inside. I mean, there were people in my prison who didn't really do much of anything, and they're serving 15, 20-year sentences. I mean, you can be a convicted criminal, in my opinion, in the United States of America, of a nonviolent, relatively minor crime, and maybe deserve 6 months in prison or a year. But once you get to 2, 3 years, you become a political prisoner because you're serving political needs of politicians who want to act like they're being tough on crime, or judges who act like they're being tough on crime, or the system, the money-making for-profit prison system, the prison industrial complex. You're fodder for that. So I would argue that most people in prison in the United States are serving sentences that are far too long for the crime they've committed. That's why we are over incarcerated. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We don't have actually more violent crime, by the way, we don't have more violent crime than any other, say, European country, but the reason we're so stuffed with prisons is because our sentences are so long, and that is political.
We have more people in prison numerically, not percentage-wise, than China does. With
Yeah.
less than a quarter of the population, we have more people in prison.
It's-
And another question about that: who is the last? I heard this somewhere else today, but who's the last prominent person who's been convicted and jailed of anything? People in politics or finance? I can't think of who it is. It might have been Rod Blagojevich, but other than that, who's gone to jail for anything?
And I think he was pardoned by Trump in the end.
He was pardoned by Trump in the end, but
That's a good point. I mean, think back to Watergate. I mean, Nixon was going to face the music. He resigned. And at that time, our system of separation of powers held the promise and the reality of holding corrupt politicians accountable. But I agree with you. Like, who is the last prominent elected official who's gone on trial? I mean, it's really crazy. I mean, look at the Epstein stuff, okay? There's more people prosecuted in the UK for the Epstein scandal than in the United States where it happened.
or even had their career ended. No one had their career ended here. It's totally
No,
fine.
I mean, has there been even one person criminally prosecuted
No.
other than Epstein himself?
No,
who
and
was-
there are no co-conspirators no co-conspirators in
I
that
guess Ghislaine Maxwell,
Ghislaine, yeah.
she was like a fall person, but I mean, God, oh Lord, it's really crazy if you think about it, that we cannot prosecute anyone for one of the most outrageous criminal enterprises, sex trafficking operations in the history of the world. So it is political. It is political. However, I want to say this. There are elements of the judiciary, in my experience as a lawyer, where judges are not political. They actually take their duties seriously. But the problem is they're becoming less and less part of the judiciary, smaller and smaller in number. And there's been a concerted plan since the early 1970s, starting with the Lewis Powell memo, as I'm sure you guys know. By the way, this is documented beautifully in a book called The Scheme, written by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, which traces the whole history of the takeover of the judiciary by right-wing elements financed by the Koch brothers funding network, the Federalist Society, Leonard Leo. So it's not an accident that our Supreme Court now is totally dominated by right-wing extremists who are really political activists in black robes. I mean, I'm talking about the 6 of the 9. And that's all the culmination of years and years of planning, financing, and work done by some of the wealthiest elements of our society who are committed to various agendas, including the agenda of preserving America as a white Christian nationalist state. And we are seeing the Trump phenomenon, as an outcome of that. And, you might remember when Obama was president and Scalia passed away, and he nominated Merrick Garland, and Obama never really fought for him. He just, they wouldn't even hold a hearing. And then Trump comes in and he gets to appoint 3 of the judges, 3 of the 6. It's really, the Supreme Court is not a court, in my opinion, as that word is commonly understood. It's the political arm of the oligarchic class, and now it's for the most part a political arm of Trump and the MAGA movement. And it's very hard to get fair decisions out of that court. And I will say that the media, there's obviously a slew of bad decisions, last year, 2 years from this court. But the media, the way it covers the court, they don't really explain what I'm telling you. I mean, they don't explain that it's really political. And they just sort of hang on to the idea that, oh, it's a court and this is the ruling. Yeah, it's kind of,
The only thing I would push back, it's really not just the right wing and the Federalist Society. I mean, the Democrats they're just as bad, because you look at who they appoint. Nobody without a record of fealty to corporations is going to get through the
Totally.
process.
And your point is well taken.
And
Yeah.
you mentioned Nixon. Nixon really, he actually appointed qualified
Yeah.
judges. And it's really sort of deteriorated since then.
Well,
I
it's
mean,
just got so,
you look at someone like Thurgood Marshall, who is a civil rights lawyer. He could never get appointed to the Supreme Court today
no.
because he doesn't have a track record defending corporations. So, I don't know how you stop that, but I mean, I think this is sort of why I brought up the question: is what has happened I mean, are all three branches now completely controlled by whatever we want to call it, the donor class? And if that's true, I mean, how are we going to get back from that? Because it seems
Well,
like we don't really have a democracy.
I-
We don't want to use the word fascism, but it's certainly not a democracy.
Look, I think, look, in terms of all three branches, I think our government has been captured, okay, by money. And, government used to sort of act as somewhat of an intermediary between the moneyed classes and the people. Now it's been captured and is acting as an instrument, in my opinion, of the money classes against the people. That's our government. It doesn't protect us anymore like it's designed to do. And I think that it's not a democracy. I don't care what, you might have the trappings of elections, but even those now are under threat. It's unclear, like, if we even have free and fair elections anymore in this country. And I really question whether we're going to be able to restabilize this country the way things are being set up right now. I mean, our elections are tainted just structurally for various reasons. The Senate is an anti-democratic branch of government where you don't have majority rule, and it's very hard to get things done. And the money classes, the oligarchs, the billionaires take advantage of the weaknesses in our system to preserve their wealth, privilege, and power. And I will say this, with reference to Trump. I was reading this book, Strong Man, that I was mentioning at the top, which I recommend to you guys. And, the professor points out that both Mussolini and Hitler assumed dictatorial power through legal means. I mean, the Reichstag in Germany gave Hitler the power to rule by decree. And Mussolini really worked through the system to gain power the way that he did. These were not military coups. I mean, they were, Hitler was named chancellor by the Weimar Republic. And he used that to parlay that into the control that he ultimately had to become a fascist dictator. So, democracy as we know it, or liberal democracy, whatever you want to call it, has a lot of space for really bad actors to take advantage and turn it on its head. And I think Trump and his team know that because they seem to be governing along the same model. I think they're hindered by the fact that, we're not all that stupid, and they don't have the control they need over the military to sort of enforce their vision. And I also think Trump is fundamentally obtuse and incompetent. Like, he doesn't have the ability to deliver, for example, economic gains to working people that I think he would need to get the kind of popular support to really fully carry out that kind of agenda. But he's trying, and it's causing, in my opinion, tremendous harm.
And again, Stephen, it's not just Trump, because you look at the War Powers Act. I mean, the fact that Trump says he doesn't need to report to Congress to start a war with Iran. Obama didn't report to Congress to start a war with. He didn't get permission from Congress to start a war with Libya, to drone strike American citizens in Yemen. So this has been sort of a steady progression
Yeah.
towards an
Yeah,
all-powerful and
let me,
really a cowardly Congress that just
yeah.
basically doesn't want to take a position on these issues of national
Well,
security.
I think, okay, so you asked, like, are the Democrats any better? I mean, what I would say to that is, yeah, they're a little bit better, but they're still captured. And I think the reason that our Congress can't, I mean, the Republicans are just gone. I mean, to me, they're like a cult party. If you compare them, they're more extremist than some of the far right parties in Europe that are openly racist and anti-immigrant. I mean, that's how one of our two major parties governs right now in the United States. The Democrats are captured. I mean, they don't know how to deal with what's happening. I mean, they can't even mobilize a national protest. I mean, when was the last time a Democratic Party said, hey, everybody, we got some serious problems. Let's hit the streets and have a general strike and shut down commerce for 2 days.
Well, their donors wouldn't allow it.
They
They're the
wouldn't
Washington
do that.
Generals, just like
Yeah,
you said about Obama not contesting the Gorsuch
yeah,
situation. And remember those days when they'd be like, "Well, what can we do? We just have all the branches of government. There's
Yeah.
nothing we can do because those dastardly Republicans have blocked the path for us. Otherwise, we'd be doing a lot of things for people. But that's all we can do." And
yeah.
that was their
It's weak.
gig.
I mean, we don't have an opposition party in this
No.
country
No.
on a national level. I mean, we have like some people trying. They kind of exist at the margins because the system's rigged. It doesn't really let those people, build the kind of power they need to have a national impact. So we don't have an opposition party. We have two corporate parties. One is totally dominated by Trump, and the other's dominated by the corporate class. I mean, there's no serious difference on economic policy, on fundamental economic policy. And by the way, getting back to the Supreme Court, I mean, there's six right-wing extremist judges. There's three liberal, centrist, corporate types. Any economic issue, they're usually ruling 8-1, 9-0. Okay, the cases where they divide are sort of the cultural war issues and sort of the unitary theory of the executive issues, but they're all united on sort of the nature of how their role is to preserve this system of domination by the wealthy and a system of extreme wealth inequality, income inequality, where millions and millions of people in our country can't get their basic needs met, including healthcare, housing, groceries. I mean, people are really suffering, and the court is protecting those who benefit most from that. I mean, the fact that we have 3,000 billionaires in America is one of the most extraordinary things. I mean, when I was growing up, like, it was like, wow, if you became a millionaire, you were rich. I mean, there's people with $1-2 billion who feel poor now because there's people with hundreds of billions of dollars, or in the case of Musk, maybe more than $1 trillion of wealth. Any society that allows that kind of accumulation of wealth in individuals is creating serious risk for democracy. You cannot have both. And, we need to have a tax system that redistributes wealth from those people to the people who really need it. And we don't have that. It's actually the opposite. We have a tax system that redistributes wealth from the working people to the wealthy because everyone knows Jeff Bezos pays about 1% of his wealth or income in taxes.
And then contracts to the military-industrial complex and gets it all back, plus then some. But Stephen, we have a hard stop here, and I just wanted to ask you before we go, really appreciate you coming on today. What are you up to now? Where can people find you? If they want to hear more about what you're doing now, what would be the best place for them to go?
So I have a website called freedonziger.com. I'm not totally free, by the way. Chevron, in the course of that case where they sued me for $60 billion, took all my money. They literally bankrupted me on the theory that I owed them money to them so they could pay their lawyers. I reimbursed them for their legal fees, but they basically wiped me out. Kaplan allowed them to wipe me out. So I started a defense fund where I ask people who believe in this work that I'm doing to make, whatever donation they can, and I use that money to pay my legal fees and to support myself. They also disbarred me without a hearing, so I can't work as a lawyer. So if people want to help, we have a campaign up on a platform called Chuffed. It's at chuffed.org. Excuse me. It's a crowdfunding platform in Australia. Over the last 4 years, over 50,000 people have made small donations to this platform, which have basically kept me and my family alive. My wife has a job. She works at a nonprofit. We're okay. We won the case in Ecuador, and I also want to mention that the case in Ecuador is not dead, like it's still alive, and right now we're raising money to try to find law firms in other countries who we can pass the mantle to so they can continue the case and try to enforce the judgment against Chevron's assets in those countries. And all of this is on the Chuff platform, and if you want to learn more about what happened to me, there's a bunch of articles up on the free Donziger.com website. Donziger is Donziger. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram at Stephen Donziger. That's where I do most of my original work, or on my Substack. It's called Donziger on Justice. And I am writing a book about this whole experience with Chevron that I'm describing to you guys, which I hope will be out in about a year.
Great. I'm a subscriber to Substack for what it's worth.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it. That's really
I
nice.
am too.
I wish I could produce more. I'm not really producing as much as I'd like.
Before you go, how many trips did you make to Ecuador, and when's the last time you were there, and what is the situation now in what they call the Amazon Chernobyl, the area that Chevron poisoned?
Well, the situation is terrible. I mean, we won the case, but they haven't paid, so there's been no cleanup. And so it's now been a half century that people have been living in poison, where they can't get access to clean water, and it's decimated the indigenous communities. Many, many people have died of oil-related cancer. And I didn't go, one of the other things is they took my passport and wouldn't let me leave the country for 7 years. I'd been there 250 times over 20 years trying to help my clients. And that's what Chevron really wanted. They didn't want me, they wanted to cut me off from my clients and cut me off from traveling to meet with lawyers in places like Canada and Brazil and other countries that could file cases to go after their assets. So they confined me here and took my passport. So even when my sentence ended, I couldn't leave the country. Well, I did get a passport finally after 7 years, and I went to Ecuador for the first time in January of this year. But I went for a sad reason. The main guy who ran the case in Ecuador, Luis Yanza, who's a Goldman Prize winner, got cancer. He's my age, I'm 64. He'd been traveling around the region for decades, and I'm pretty certain exposures to the pollution ended up causing this disease to manifest. And in March, he tragically passed away at a young age. And I went down for his funeral in the Amazon. It was the first time I've been in the Amazon, in over 7 years, and saw a bunch of my clients. And, many had passed, others had cancer. It's a tragedy. And the world needs to know about this. I call it the quiet massacre. It's not like, a bomb drops and 1,000 people died at one time. It is day by day, there's 1, 2, 3 people dying. This area has tens of thousands of people, and they cannot escape an environment where they're constantly exposed to cancer-causing toxins from Chevron's pollution. So, our goal is to pick up the mantle now that I'm able to travel and really find lawyers to pick up the case and go finish the job, because there's never been a case in history with a judgment this large over an environmental pollution problem. And that's why they fought me so hard. They used 60 law firms and 2,000 lawyers to fight me, and I'm working out of my kitchen. Now, I had a lot of support, as I mentioned, all those people, judges, Nobel laureates, et cetera, who backed me up, and they helped actually get me and my family through this. We're strong. We're obviously not silenced. I'm speaking out. I feel great, although I still grieve every day for my clients in Ecuador and for the tragedy of what this case represents. But I'm fighting, and I want people to know that they can help by going to the freedonziger.com site or the chuff.org site, because the only way to get this job done is through good lawyers and mass public support from well-meaning people, environmental activists, and indigenous peoples all over the world who recognize the importance of this case in terms of really defining a new kind of paradigm to get justice for indigenous peoples and vulnerable communities, which is what it is, and which is why they spent so much money locking me up and attacking me and confining me and taking my money and taking my law license. They don't want these types of cases to exist. And they want any lawyer who thinks about joining this kind of case to look at Steve Donziger and say, oh my God, look what they did to that guy. I'm not going to take that risk. And I'm out here every day telling people, no, 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 they didn't get me. Okay, I'm here and we can do this. So I'm hoping that this case will pick up again soon. I'm not a lawyer. I won't be, out in the front like I've been for 20 years, but I will be doing what I can to organize it, to support my clients and to give support. So I'm optimistic despite many of the things I've said on this podcast. I remain optimistic that we, the people, have more power than we realize. Let's show some courage. Let's take that first step. Let's continue to organize and build our power, and ultimately we can achieve victories that I think not only can get justice in this case for the people of Ecuador, but also transform our society so we can live in the kind of just world that I think we all strive for.
That would be great. Thank you again, Stephen, for taking
Thanks
the
for
time.
what you do. I appreciate you inviting me on.
Yeah, it was
Thanks
great.
for
We'd love
your-
to have you
thanks
back
for your
when we
work.
have more time, and we can cover more things. We'd love to hear about it.
Anytime. Happy to come back anytime.
All right.
Thanks,
And don't
guys.
forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for this podcast.
All right.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Stephen.
We will.
Oh, we would love you to do that. Thank you.